Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the south where the Russians have restarted operations into Robotina and have managed to reach the center for the third time. This is the third time over the past 2 months where the Russians have entered Robotina and gained a foothold within the central parts of the village, and heavy fighting continues as the situation is reaching yet another stalemate within the center of Robotina. The Russians so far have had no issue with entering Robotina, but haven't had an issue with gaining control over any of the fortifications that allow them to hold their positions within the village and gain control of it. So far, every time that the Russians have launched assaults into Robotina, we've seen further advances on the eastern parts of the front. And now that the Russians have full control over the Surovikin line, we may see further attempts by the Russians to cancel out these Ukrainian gains that happened throughout the summer offensive. So far, we have seen that the Russian progress in the area has been extremely slow, similar to the Ukrainian process during their summer offensive. The main reason is likely that the Russians started out with the same strategy that the Ukrainians ended out with, and that is the small infantry assaults. So far, there has been limited usage of armored vehicles, mainly to get into a foothold within Robotina, where it's usually just a couple of armored vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles covering for infantry to drop off and fight within the village. However, we've seen no armored assaults by the Russians. This is likely to avoid the same mistakes the Ukrainians made during the summer offensive, where they were halted by artillery, airstrikes, and minefields. Not to mention the heaps of drones, the swarms of drones flying everywhere throughout the front. My expectations for this part of the front line is that it will continue with this slow development until either the Ukrainians withdraw from the area or the Russians actually manage to clear the way for an armored assault to break through the Ukrainian defenses, mainly the trenches here to the north and to the east of Robotina, which will allow the Russians to cut off the main supply route. And we're already seeing that although there hasn't been any periods with a lot of rain, which makes it very difficult to drive through these open fields, the real muddy weather hasn't really started yet. However, if armored vehicles drive in the same direction multiple times, eventually it will become muddy, as there is this footage here where the Ukrainians were doing a demonstration run for journalists. A Ukrainian Challenger 2 tank got stuck in the mud and sunk down into it, which made it very difficult for them to pick it out, if they have even been able to do so far. It happened yesterday in the morning. So with this, we see that despite there hasn't been any long period of concentrated rain, we still see that the weather is already difficult with the mud being as it is in Ukraine. The lighter Soviet tanks and Russian tanks have an advantage when it comes to this. They don't sink as much, but if you use the same road multiple times, you end up getting stuck. So if the Russians manage to cut off this road right here, cutting it off, preventing the Ukrainians from resupplying through it, there's no other paved roads, and the Ukrainians would either be forced to withdraw from these areas or continuously resupply until their vehicles get stuck in the mud, and it makes it very difficult for them to hold on to their positions with such a resupply road. Based on this, we see that the Russians have an interest in cutting off this road, as well as to draw out the fight after they've cut off the road. Until they've cut off the road, I don't see any real reason for them to extend the battle, which likely indicates that the Ukrainian resistance is very fierce and prevents the Russians from actually achieving any success within the village of Robotina. One way to cut off the road is to attack from the side. The other is to go through Robotina itself, which is to go through the fortifications that the Ukrainians have in the north. And this is the main issue for the Russians moving forward, to fight over these fortifications, both to the north and to the east of Robotina. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Novomykhailivka, the Russians have made a very small advancement here in the northern parts, as is seen with this duplicated footage. And based on this, we see that there is active operations in the north, with infantry assault groups moving through the separate area here in the north, allowing them to gain access to the road here to the northwest, or central northern parts of the town, to allow them to connect between the two sides and gain control over and consolidate their gains in the northern and eastern parts of Novomykhailivka. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Nevelske, yet again more geolocated footage showing a small advance by the Russians as they're getting closer and closer to Nevelske. Nevelske has two fortified areas so far, which is here in the northern parts and in the southern parts. The southern one prevents the Russians from storming the village from the forest lines here to the south. They have to fight through and capture this fortification before they can start launching assaults into the village from the south. They can launch directly ahead from the eastern parts, but they would have to go through an open field. The third location is the forest line to the north, which is covered by the fortification in the north. So the Russians have to gain control over these fortifications before they can start storming the village itself, unless they go through with armored assaults through the open field, where they likely have to go through minefields and ATGM and everything else that the Ukrainians have available of weapons to destroy these armored vehicles. Just north of here, we see in the direction of Pervomaiske that the Russians have extended their zone of control here in the central parts of the town. And with this, they have cut off the connection between the northern and southern parts. It is likely that the Russians will look to gain control over the final parts to the north, as well as to cut off the Ukrainians here in the south and gain control over that as well. These will be the two targets for the Russians going forward after these developments in the central parts of the town. Moving slightly further north, we see here in the direction of Berdychi, the Russians have made a small advancement yet again, where they've regained control over some of these areas, which were contested previously due to the Ukrainian counterattacks, mainly using Abrams and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, where we see that the Ukrainians continuously launched counterattacks towards the Russians. The Russians then responded by heavily bombarding the back line of Berdychi, which has subsequently allowed the Russians to regain some of these positions, which are right next to Abrams tanks that were destroyed by the Russians here in the southern parts, by the cemetery in the central parts, which was the first one, in another position somewhere here in the northern parts, and one here in the northeast of the village. These are all the 4 locations of the Abrams tanks being destroyed so far. And with this, we see that there's continuous efforts by the Russians and Ukrainians to fight here within Berdychi. At the same time, here to the south, we see that with the advances by Tonenke and Orelivka, the Russians have regained the initiative here in the fighting. Previously, the Ukrainians were launching a lot of counterattacks, regaining some positions both in Tonenke and regaining a foothold within Orelivka, as well as regaining positions in Berdychi. Now, all of the advances the Ukrainians made in Tonenke have been negated by the Russians, and some of the advances in the north by Berdychi have been negated. It is likely that the Russians are relocating soldiers to relaunch offensive operations here west of Avdiivka. So we will see a restart of operations very soon by Avdiivka, where the Russians will launch another attack to gain control over the villages of Berdychi, Semnivka, the rest of Orelivka and Tonenke, Umanske and Yasnobrodivka, combining this with the fighting by Pervomaiske and Nevelske, allowing them to gain full control over this area right here. Or never mind, sorry, Zelensky says Russian advances in Ukraine has halted. All of these advances are reported on are apparently fake, because who knows the situation better than Zelensky. It seems that the Russians have simply stopped advancing because the Super Abrams that have received no losses have magically managed to stop the Russian advances, and no Russian offensive is coming. The Ukrainians are going to turn the situation around, and even without USA, they'll simply just recapture all of Ukraine to the 1991 borders. Congratulations, Ukraine. Zelensky got your back. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.